to our
Recording in progress.
so now I'm going to handle the microphone to our youth, Jumana Dahoud.
Thank you. Okay. Hello all, and welcome to our webinar tonight. Thank you all for being here. Before we begin, I just want to make sure that everyone's on mute. Our webinar today is about a report back from the occupied bank that will be presented by Nadine Mansour. Nadine Mansour is a Palestinian British activist and grassroots organizer based in the San Francisco Bay Area, where she has mobilized communities around ceasefire resolutions and education for elected officials. She also recently returned from a solidarity trip to the West Bank, where she provided protective presence for Palestinian families experiencing settler violence and harassment. She's an associate director of marketing and communications at an international firm where she leads strategy and works to build large-scale communication programs. Nadine earned her MPH at University of California at Davis, an undergraduate degree in communications from Boston University. Nadine, we thank you for being here with us tonight, and I will go ahead and pass it to you to begin.
Thank you so much, Joanna, and thank you everyone for having me this evening. I'm just going to quickly share my screen, and then I will get things moving. So thank you again for having me. It's an honor to be with this community this evening. And as Joanna mentioned, I actually just came back from a 1-month-long solidarity trip to the West Bank, where, for those who are not familiar with what protective presence is, it's a form of solidarity where those Palestinians or those who are not Palestinians can use their privilege as international passport holders to stand in solidarity with Palestinian families who are experiencing settler violence and harassment. And the purpose of protective presence is to ensure that we are documenting and also, where it is possible, deterring settler violence from happening, which also involves preventing displacement of these families. And so before I get going, I think that's just important context that, I actually went with a delegation from the San Francisco Bay Area. There are also like non-American groups that also do this kind of work as well, including, and there's an Italian group on the ground. And there are some Israeli activists that do this type of work on a day-to-day basis as well. So all the photography, all the videos that you'll see in this presentation as well are ones that I took myself or were taken by, activist colleagues who were there with me during my month-long trip in April through May timeframe. And so I was actually stationed in an area known as Masafayata, which is in Area C of the occupied West Bank. It's a very rural shepherding community, largely a Bedouin community. And what you'll notice from this map is it's kind of the largest, closest city is really Hebron. But what you'll see is that it's extremely close to the border of 48, which makes it a, oh, my screen sharing is paused. Can you see my screen?
No, we cannot see it. It's not moving.
No, we can't.
Okay, here we go.
Not anymore.
Interesting. Hold on. Sorry about that. I just got a
We're
notice.
gonna I'll give it 20 minutes. Latest 5:30.
Yes.
I don't mind if he sleeps extra because of the vaccine the other day.
Yeah, he's been really off for that.
Okay. For some reason it's not letting me share anymore. It's saying screen sharing is paused.
أدير أنت سويتي إشي من عندك؟
No, Nadine, I can see your screen.
You can see the screen? You can see the screen?
Yeah, me too. I can see the screen.
Okay, perfect. For some reason I'm
Now
getting
we
a
can.
notice that it's paused. Okay, if you don't see my screen, let me know because I can't really see on my end. So basically, you'll notice that this area where I was stationed is very close to the border of 48. So it makes it a very easy target for settlers to continue their policy of expanding Israel. You'll also notice, obviously, because the West Bank is so small, we were only about 30 miles away from Gaza. So every day we could hear planes flying overhead on their way to Gaza, where obviously a genocide is currently taking place. And the thing I really want to make clear, because I think it's really difficult to stay afloat on what is happening. But the point is that this community, Masafa Yatta, which is a collection of Palestinian villages, is facing the largest forced expulsions since 1967, and this massive, extreme uptick in settler violence and harassment in the last 9 months, which I think we've also been seeing across the West Bank. So this is not unique. This is really something that we continue to see throughout the West Bank. But what makes Masafa Yatta particularly a controversial place is because it is in what is known as a firing zone. And I don't think this is a concept that is readily understood or most folks are aware of, but firing zones are a creation of Israel. So they are these closed military zones that are basically only reserved for military training purposes. So once a firing zone is established, it means that no one is allowed to live there. So we are seeing these firing zones cropping up all over the West Bank. So it's not just in Masafa Yatta. We're seeing these crop up in Jericho, in Tuba. And so they're always strategically designated too. So they will designate them not only in Area C, but B and A. And these firing zones are the brainchild of the former Prime Minister of Israel, Ariel Sharon, in 1979. And we know that they are not for military training purposes only, because in a document that was leaked from a top secret meeting, the former Prime Minister of Israel, Sharon, told the World Zionist Organization Settlement Division, which is a division of the Israeli government that exists to this day, that handles kind of the expansion and the maintenance of these settlements in the occupied West Bank. He himself said that firing zones were created with one purpose, and it was to ensure that there was land reserved for the Jewish-only settlements. And so, again, why Masafa Yatta is such a kind of a unique place is because firing zone 918, so there's like 918 different firing zones, was established in Masafa Yatta, and it impacts more than 12 Palestinian villages where families live today. And so you'll see these firing zones, and this is firing zone 918. The red and the yellow is the firing zone, and red basically depicts that this is an active firing zone. So the Israeli military is claiming that they are conducting, military training of some kind. And then the yellow area, which is still within the firing zone, is what they claim is inactive. But it still means that Palestinians can no longer live in there. And you'll see these blue dots within the yellow area, and those are Israeli shepherding outposts. And so you're starting to see that even though these areas within the firing zone are considered inactive, Palestinian families are not allowed to go back in and return to their homes. In fact, settlers are coming in and they're establishing outposts instead. Oh, sorry. Yeah, you can only see that. Let me say sorry.
فلسطينية بس من بريطانيا British.
Let me try and do this.
Please, guys, mute your phones and computers. Yeah.
This out. Sorry. Don't know why it's not working. Okay, let's try this again. Can you see anything now?
No, somehow every time you hit present, it just goes to another screen. It must have. It just stays here.
Okay, 1 second. Sorry about this. All right.
Here we go. That's
Okay.
it. Yes.
Perfect. So apologies. This is the firing zone. Red is active, yellow inactive, blue.
Now it looks like it's a firing zone.
This is the firing zone. Yes, yes.
Perfect.
And so the point is, even though these families are getting evicted from these areas, settlers are coming in and establishing these outposts. And I'll go a little bit through what the outposts and the settlements are. But the point is, this has been happening for a really, really long time. The firing zone was established in the 1980s. And what happened in the 1980s, well, actually in 1999, the Israeli military rounded up 1,000+ residents who were living on Palestinian-owned land in these firing zones and expelled them from the area. They were effectively rounded up in a truck and then literally dumped at the bottom of a village where most of the activists were staying during our time in Masafa Yatta. And so this is actually a testimony from one of the Palestinians that we work with on the ground, who's also, part of the kind of Palestinian activist community. And they, his grandmother made this statement. They arrived at sunset and parked their truck at the entrance of the cave where we lived. Back then, there were 14 families living in the village. Soldiers put all of our possessions into the truck, clothes, pots and pans, and food. And one of the soldiers picked up an iron bed while my grandson was on it, a baby. I grabbed the bed from the soldier's hand and I said to him, "What are you doing?" He said he was doing it so that you will leave. And around 100 soldiers took part in the expulsion that day. The soldiers did not leave anything, no mattresses, no blankets. They took the flour, the bread, the food to force us to leave. And so obviously this is so reminiscent of the Nakba of 1948. And it's a reminder that the Nakba never ended. Obviously it's happening at such a smaller scale, but these communities are facing basically mass displacement. So obviously once they were expelled, these Palestinian families, they petitioned to the Israeli Supreme Court demanding that they be allowed to return to their homes. And so just so you know, forced evictions are inconsistent. In fact, I'll go as far as saying that they're in violation with international humanitarian law. They violate basic human rights, which allow and ensure that we as individuals should all have access to adequate housing, water, sanitation, health, education, and privacy. And so even though we know that the judicial and legal system of Israel is inherently biased against Palestinians, no judge worth his salt or her salt would sign the legal documentation that was required to make the eviction permanent. And so the court, in fact, issued this interim injunction, which would allow the Palestinians to return to their homes, but with very specific conditions. They were not allowed to expand or build their homes. So that meant everything from, I can't build a toilet, to not being able to build infrastructure like water wells or power lines. Even if they fell down, I wouldn't be able to replace them. And so effectively they were asking these Palestinian families to freeze literally in time. And then in May 2022, during the pandemic, the Israeli High Court ruled against the Palestinians, even though the Palestinian families in this area were able to provide aerial footage to the court that documented that they had been in that land decades prior to the establishment of the firing zone. And so the reason why I share this is because these families are at risk, who were able to return, are now at a risk of eviction at a moment's notice. And so one thing I'll just share with you, this is again this is activists like we work with, who just shares that since the decision was made in 2022, harassment and violence happens to them every day. People are arrested and beaten, vehicles are repeatedly confiscated, agricultural land and homes are bulldozed. But I think what is so clear is that these families are so resilient. No matter what, they will stay in their land. Even if the Israelis demolish everything, they will remain on the rubble and they will not leave our land. And that's exactly what these families are doing. So this is actually one of the families I stayed with. And this was their home that got demolished by an Israeli bulldozer. And so now this family of about 12 lives in this tent, which you can see on the bottom. And so I actually lived inside of a tent for a period of time. And what's really devastating about this situation is, their water wells have been destroyed repeatedly. There are outposts that encircle them. There are two of the most violent settlements on each of the hills that surround them. So they are surrounded on all sides, and they are the last family remaining in this area. And one of the stories I wanted to share with you is actually the story of Haroon. And you'll see on the left-hand side, there's an image of a cave. And this is another family I stayed with who who basically have been experiencing severe and extreme levels of settler violence. In fact, they actually only require activists to stay with them overnight because they are explicitly targeted overnight by settlers from one of the settlements that's just behind their home. But what I wanted to focus on is their son, Haroon. And Haroon was a 23-year-old Palestinian man who was set to get married and, you know, really just wanted to build a home for him and his future wife. And so he started to construct a home. And in this area, which is actually not only just an Area C thing, there's a hotline that settlers can phone to notify the police that Palestinians are building or constructing in the area. And so that's what happened. And so at least 2 or 3 occurrences as Haroon tried to build a home, his home or the foundations of the home were demolished. And so he actually built this cave, and this is the cave that we slept in during our time there. And that's where his mom and his 2 sisters sleep every night as well. So one day, you know, a neighbor whose home had also just been demolished and they were actively trying to rebuild it, they were using a generator for the construction. And again, the settlers called this hotline and reported that construction was taking place. And so the IOF and the police appeared on the scene and they tried to confiscate the generator. And Haroon did not want to give the generator open. So they actually ended up shooting him in the neck at point blank range. And so he was paralyzed. He actually was a paraplegic. And I think obviously that's a story that I think we all have heard in some capacity. But I think to describe just the level of hate and violence and dehumanization that is taking place by these settlers to these Palestinian families is the fact that even though this man was paralyzed and is unable to move, he was living in this cave that he had built for 2 years until his death. You know, he died of the most tragic thing. He died of bed sores because of his inability to move. But every single day, these settlers who were responsible for effectively his ultimate death would actually come into the cave and terrorize this paralyzed man. And on one occasion, they even set the bed that he was sleeping in on fire. And the only reason he did not demise that day is because his mother overheard his screams and was able to extinguish the flames. And I think these are the stories that we were hearing from the families. And actually this poster that you see kind of beneath Body, Home and Life is a poster that's inside the cave that his mother had created for him to commemorate his life. So obviously, you know, I'm going to be sharing some of the stories of the families I stayed with, and it kind of buckets out into 3 key areas. And again, this is 1 month of my experience, so by no means is this intended to be comprehensive at all. And I know many of us have stories of this or have experienced many of these instances of settler violence or harassment, and obviously the brutality of the occupation. But what I really wanted to deep dive into is 1, the Israeli outposts that we're seeing and the expansion of these settlements, which is intentionally forcing Palestinians off their land. 2, it's just this massive uptick in the amount of settler violence and daily harassment that's happening in full support, fully supported by Israeli occupation forces and state officials. And then 3, just also this massive influx in the amount of drones and surveillance and IOF presence that we're seeing, not only to monitor Palestinians, but also for activists who are doing this type of international solidarity work. So I feel like some of this is going to be basic and then some of this is going to be new for others, but I think it's just important to reiterate that many of these settlers in areas like Mosafah Yatta are heavily armed. And they're heavily armed because folks like Ben Gvir are arming these settlers. In fact, following October 7th, Ben Gvir provided more than 10,000 arms to Israeli settlers. And he has been encouraging, like many, many other state officials, he has been encouraging settlers to, what he says, head to the hilltops and settle them. And so outposts obviously are illegal under Israeli law. yet they're being encouraged by state officials. And these outposts basically start in different ways. So the one that you'll see on this page is actually one that was actually, and I'm sorry, it's like not a great photo, but it was an image I took, which is very close to a family I was staying with. And you'll notice it's a bus. So basically an outpost in this case is several violent and heavily armed settlers have literally decided to park a bus on Palestinian land and are living in this bus, you know, mere meters from this Palestinian's home. And what happens is these outposts quickly become connected to existing settlements. And you actually see that on the bottom image. So during my time, 1 month, it went from seeing a bus being parked on the hilltop. And then the bottom image, you're seeing these settlers now starting to connect the electricity lines to one of the settlements just pretty much down the road. So eventually you create these corridor settlements until Palestinians are either kind of like choked, completely surrounded. And these settlements, as we all know, are obviously gated communities for Jewish-only settlers, and they're illegal under international law. And I just want to remind folks again, like this is not just happening in Masafa Yatta. So you see these red bullets. These are new Israeli outposts that are cropping up all over the West Bank, which have been cropping up since October 7th. So this is not just a rural Bedouin shepherding community issue. We are actively seeing these outposts, which eventually will expand into settlements happening across the West Bank all over. And so for those, you know, again, I think this environment of like who the settlers are, like how are they funded is dramatically changing too. And so again, basically, you know, we know that there's over 700,000 Israeli settlers that are living in the West Bank. We know that most of them are from European countries, but we also know that 100,000 of them are American citizens. And they are being financed and armed not only by Israel, but they're also being funded by nonprofits here in the US. Tax-exempt nonprofits are funding these Israeli settlers who are stealing the Palestinian land. In fact, they are raising not only money to get Israeli settlers who are violent and terrorize Palestinians or even kill Palestinians, they're even raising money for arms or accessories that make guns even more dangerous, but they're tax exempt in our communities. And so I just urge you to keep an eye on legislation such as Not on Our Dime, which is legislation coming out of New York right now, which is intending to effectively remove the tax exempt status for these nonprofits that are fronting as, you know, protection of Jewish heritage, but are in fact funding violence against Palestinians in the West Bank. And also wealthy donors are also funding these settler groups as well. And the settler group that we mostly interacted with while we were here in Masafa Yatta is the Hilltop Youth, which some of you may know. It's one of the most notoriously violent, young religious settler groups who regularly attack nearby Palestinians. And it is incredibly disheartening to see how young these settlers are. And they are young, vulnerable youth that are predated upon by the Israeli state system. So many of them, you know, are young Israelis or Europeans who find themselves in Europe who have behavioral issues or are orphans and are basically armed and told just protect the land at all costs. And so a lot of our interactions were actually with 16, 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old boys and girls who were at the forefront of the violence that we were witnessing while we were there. And what's also happening is that we're seeing these settlers become increasingly emboldened. So I showed you that image of that outpost with the bus. these are the settlers that live in the bus. And what is happening in this video, and this is actually, so while we were there, we were doing a lot of like reporting and sharing a lot of our footage with, you know, Al Jazeera and other like news outlets. And Al Jazeera actually ended up publishing this, which is great because it's part of, you know, needing us to tell the stories of what's happening on the ground. But these are the settlers that live in that bus who have now felt so emboldened that they are now coming down to the Palestinian family's home and literally making themselves at home. And what's not very obvious from this video is that the settlers were heavily armed. Most of their guns are behind their backs. And this is a sofa that I sat on pretty much every day while I was there, you know, looking up to the outpost. And now we're seeing these settlers coming down and making themselves at home. And I've got, obviously, this is just, you know, a means to intimidate in the aspiration that the family will ultimately leave because they fear for their lives. Which leads me to, you know, what kind of settler violence and harassment did I see? And what did I witness again in a month's time? And it was really so diverse. So on the left-hand side, you'll see, and I'm sorry if it makes folks dizzy, but you'll see that basically what is happening here is that a settler is driving on a motorcycle and they're effectively just trying to disrupt the fact that these shepherds are trying to, you know, graze their sheep. And so what they are doing now is they're trying to basically make shepherding so intolerable that these families will no longer graze their sheep, which is of course their livelihood. And so I was witnessing this multiple times where if it's not a motorcycle, it's an ATV. And there were families that literally were so afraid to graze that they're forced to buy feed for their animals. And these are incredibly poor people who cannot sustain purchasing food for their animals. They rely on the land. And so again, it's a way to make life just absolutely impossible. The other thing we experienced, and this is actually, again, footage I took, I actually, in this photo at the bottom middle, this is actually one of my activist friends who was intentionally being pushed by a settler on a horse as a means to intimidate because they noticed that she was filming what was taking place. And again, this is happening day upon day. In the top middle video, what's happening here is that these settlers on horseback knew that the parents had left for the day to head to a village. And so they knew that the children of this area, and this is the one where the people are living in the tents, they knew that the children would be alone at this time, that it was exclusively me and another activist. And so they basically came as soon as they knew the parents were no longer there, simply just to intimidate the children. And just as a joke, the one thing I will say is that these settlers are so non-indigenous to this land that they are terrible at both shepherding and horse riding. It is borderline embarrassing how bad they are at horseback riding because it is not in their DNA. So I will say that. And then finally, on the far right, while we were there, I was actually having dinner with a family and we heard this massive explosion. And effectively settlers had come in while we were having dinner and decided to set their working truck ablaze. And this was the second time in just 6 weeks that they had done this. Because one, they know that vehicles in this area are extremely expensive and that, you know, this is a family that actually has a vehicle to go to work. They want to prevent these individuals from being able to earn a livelihood. Here's another image on the left-hand side of a shepherd we spend a lot of time with. This is actually the day I was leaving. We got an urgent call from an Israeli activist who had gotten word that there had been a violent assault. And so we ran to the scene and we found this, you know, shepherd covered in blood. I mean, there was blood all over the place and we called an ambulance. And of course, a report was written and nothing happened. And this is, you know, constant day in the life of a Palestinian shepherd where, you know, you can report, you can have Israeli activists who document it and still nothing is done. And on the right-hand side, I think I just also want to call attention to the fact that one, these settlers are heavily armed, but they're also using like shepherding as a new means of land grabbing. So not only are they disrupting grazing of Palestinian sheep, but they themselves have now become shepherds. And they do this as a way to kind of make excuses for their need to take more and more land. And that's actually more of a recent tactic that they have appropriated from Palestinian shepherds since about 2018, that we're seeing more and more of this happening. The other area I wanted to talk to is just the sheer amount of drones, surveillance, and IOF that we were subjected to during our time there. And again, this is all footage that we captured ourselves, and I'll just kind of talk left to right. But basically, you'll see this drone, and as a result of international solidarity activists being able to document some of these like violent assaults, there have been sanctions of some settlers. It's still too low. It's not that much. But because we are able to document some of these instances, we are starting to see sanctions coming out of the State Department. And so someone like Ben-Gvir has openly criticized solidarity activists such as myself and our group for being a source of instability in the region. And in fact, while we were even there in the West Bank, Ben-Gvir actually announced the formation of a police team that would be exclusively tasked with monitoring activists on the ground. So from the time that I arrived to the time I left, we had multiple activists that had been deported on the spot. We actually saw a massive influx in the amount of drones that were surveilling our movement. In fact, I even woke up one morning in a tent with a drone flying over my face, trying to capture images of my face. And again, you know, I don't want to focus on myself because there are constantly drones like surveilling and trying to capture footage of what Palestinians are doing. But I think in a way it was kind of validation that, you know, the Israelis, they recognize that international solidarity and protective presence is having an impact in a small way, but a tangible way. And so they want to try and intimidate those who actually go to the West Bank to be in solidarity with Palestinians who are facing lots and lots of violence. The other thing I'll just say is obviously the amount of IOF presence was dramatic. We were constantly, it was day and night, driving by in tanks, all kinds of vehicles. The one thing I'll note is that there are so many different versions of police now, because since October 7th, because more typical IOF that would be otherwise stationed in this area are going to Gaza, they are giving more and more autonomy to these, what are now called settler soldiers. And so you would see these kind of like jeeps that aren't necessarily military vehicles driving around, and it would look like there would be soldiers inside of the vehicle, but in fact, they're just settlers fully armed, wearing green. And I'll never forget one settler who was fully dressed like a soldier is wearing a green Gucci t-shirt with some like Timberland boots, and he's wearing like a Louis Vuitton belt, and they're just pretty much doing what they think they can do, but they don't really have like the full power of actual police or IOF. They don't have the ability to arrest, for instance. It's just more of an intimidation tactic. So I just wanted to share a little bit about just the surveillance. And the other thing I also wanted to raise awareness to is specifically an AI system that we kind of came into contact with several times. And it's an AI surveillance system known as the Wolfpack system. And so there's kind of two different aspects of the Wolfpack system. One is obviously what it's doing is it's capturing images of Palestinians in the area and all over the West Bank. One of them is called Red Wolf, which is particularly common in areas like Al Khalil in Hebron. And it's basically the cameras that you see at the checkpoints that are scanning people's faces and obviously color coding individuals' faces as to whether or not they should be detained or arrested, or you know, whether they're this or that. But there's another system that we've started to see emerge that we actually saw quite a bit, and that's known as Blue Wolf. And it's a smartphone AI system that the settlers and the IOF are now using, which is, again, its ability to take pictures of your face and then having access to a database of Palestinians in their phone, which they're now incentivizing soldiers to do more and more of by gamifying it. So the more photos you capture of a Palestinian or an activist now, the more likely you are to get a bonus, or the more likely the more days off you're allowed. So they're being incentivized to capture as much footage as they can and upload it to this system, which is, you know, again, individuals are being labeled all kinds of things, as you can imagine. And it's just making it more of a police state than it has been for the last 76 years. So I think that's pretty sickening that, again, these types of systems are being gamified to, you know, make this this occupation, of course, more and more brutal. Obviously, we're all familiar with flying checkpoints and permanent checkpoints and just the amount of surveillance that we're seeing. But I think what I'll just share with you is that, you know, the way in which the Israelis weaponize these flying checkpoints in particular and closing of checkpoints is obviously a form of collective punishment. And one of the families I stayed with have a really sick young boy who actually, during my time staying with them, needed to take their son to the hospital. I was also in the West Bank at a time when a lot of the raids in like Nablus and Ramallah like had started to crop up. And so we were randomly seeing checkpoints being just shut randomly. And so suddenly this family who needed to take their son to the hospital had no way of getting to the hospital. And so we had to get in the 4x4, go on a dirt road. It's treacherous, there's rocks everywhere, and the car gets a flat tire. And this family obviously can't afford to buy a truck. So obviously they end up having to call someone to get them. The police arrive, confiscate the truck, and obviously we end up having to walk all the way home with their sick child. And again, that's just an example of how these checkpoints, both flying and permanent, are being used to obviously like impact and disrupt Palestinian life. And finally, all our series, obviously these injustices extend across the West Bank. After I had left Masafa Yatta, I did go and spend some time in Al-Quds, and I did go spend some time in Bethlehem as well. And I just want to talk a little bit about the Ida refugee camp in Bethlehem for those who are not familiar or haven't actually gone to Ida refugee camp. But it's it's actually really sad, but it's actually one of the most tear gas places in the world. And that's according to a UC Berkeley study, because ultimately it's in a really interesting area in Bethlehem where it's kind of partially enclosed by the apartheid wall. It has more than 8 watchtowers that overlook into the refugee camp. It's by one of the most heavily guarded checkpoints, right? And also there's a military training area right by the refugee camp as well. So it is one of the most tear-gassed areas in the world, according to this study. And we visited it because we actually had, we're going to donate some clothes for the children there. And I met this gentleman who actually changes the tear gas canisters into art. And what was like really sad to me, and again, this is a reminder that, you know, we're privileged in being here in the US and that we do have a role to play, and that the US has a very important role in maintaining and upholding the occupation. All the tear gas canisters that they showed in the store literally said made in the USA. And so one of my friends who bought a ring was joked to by the shop owner who said, you know, it's made in the USA and now you're returning the ring that's made from the tear gas canister back to the USA. And also, you know, at the entrance of this refugee camp as well, obviously has the key, which is obviously symbolic to us as Palestinians. Ida means return. you know, we will return. And obviously, these people are just so resilient, despite the fact that this is one of they have been nukbud and nuxered, and are living in this refugee camp. These are some images I captured. I think, again, just a reminder that while we were in Hebron, we saw this image, and it's Congress must stop funding Israeli apartheid. You know, we all full well know that the role that the US is playing in upholding apartheid. The other image I just want to share, and it's in the top middle, is an image that we captured while we were speaking to some shopkeepers in Hebron. And you'll notice that they're kafirs. And what had happened is, during the flag march, which has just recently happened, but last year during the flag march in Hebron, is settlers literally came in and set his shop on fire, and they burnt these kafirs. And there's this beautiful sign that he'd written which says, "Burning the shop, but we are steadfast." And that's what I experienced from these families while I was there. It's just steadfastness and resilience. You know, I really understood how important these ordinary moments are. You know, the moment of drinking tea and sitting with friends and being outside and having the ability to play. I was there at a time where animals were being born and wheat was being harvested by the families and the children. And I learned so much about the land and how it could be used, whether or not it could be a medicine. And it was just a really important reminder for me, just how ordinary moments, while ordinary and sometimes very boring, oftentimes in this context, were always accompanied by harrowing events. And so, you know, I share these people's stories with you because I think it's important to acknowledge not only the privilege that we have being in the US, but also the responsibility that we have to raise our voices at a time where we need to continue to raise our voices. And because of the role that the US is playing in upholding this brutal occupation, which has escalated in the last 9 months. And so with that, I will just say we all have a responsibility to uphold our heritage, be loud, and push for a free Palestine. And that is the end of my presentation. And I'm happy to take any questions at all, because I know I need 45 minutes. And thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you, Nadine, for this wonderful, informative presentation. We will now go ahead and take any questions at this time. You guys can put them in the chat or raise your hand.
I guess everyone is speechless because of what you said. Thank you, Nadine. That's very informative and heartbreaking.
Yeah, yes, indeed.
Dr. Mazen, you can go ahead with your question.
Hi, Nadine. Nadine, thank you for the done presentation. And yeah, to hear these stories, most of us, the elderly who lived in back home, you know a lot. But I think there is a new tactics that the settlers are using since we left back home in late 80s. So you've been there, you heard what's going on. What else we could do? We tried everything with these settlers, and they are getting worse and worse. Sharon, he said, occupy every hill in Palestine. They have been doing that. They formed these organizations. As Bet Sahur USA organization, we are nonprofit. We are not supposed to be, involved in politics too much. What we could do, to help out, it is teaching our young adults is the way to go. Same as these guys are teaching their 16 and 15 young people. Should we be sending young adults there? What is your thoughts about the best, how we could help? We are here, we are far away, we go visit once in a while, but we feel really hopeless and we cannot do much. So what do you recommend for us as a Sahuri community living in the USA? Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. I think it's kind of like well, one, I want to acknowledge the fact that I too was feeling hopeless, and that was one of the reasons why I decided to participate in this kind of work. I knew I didn't have the skill set to go to Gaza and offer like medical expertise, and so this was the next best thing for me to be able to feel like I was doing something. So I just want to acknowledge that point. I think education plays an important role. We have to educate the youth, and I think there is a tendency, I feel this way, to want to shield the youth away from the realities because we don't want them to realize just how bad it is sometimes. But I think that's our responsibility to educate the youth about what is actually happening. There has never been an instance where someone reads a book about Palestine and ends up on the opposite side. It's just a fact. You know, it's not that complex. It's relatively simple. So I think one is education. Two, we do need people to do this kind of work. And I think the reality is, you know, I also went through this as myself, you know, as a Palestinian, am I doing more harm than good by going there to be at the front lines? And the reality is, no, I have a privilege as an international passport holder. So if that is something that you feel driven to do, that should not be a barrier for you to do this kind of work. You can document and you can help to deter, because ultimately these folks, while they are both emboldened, they are fearful of sanctions. And then I think the third piece, which I think is a little bit more tangible, and it's not specific to this organization, but as individuals, we are all part of organizations, you know, whether it's international, national, whatever, local organizations, and money fuels the occupation. So if it's anything from preventing your organization from matching donations to some of these organizations that have been sanctioned or in some shape or form contributing to the occupation, that is a tangible impact that you can have. Or, you know, basically mobilizing within your organizations in a thoughtful, appropriate way. It really does have an impact. It's kind of what we've been seeing, you know, it's slow, but we know that the BDS movement has had a huge impact, not only over the last 76 years, but in recent months, we do see change coming where investment funds are pulling their investments from, you know, Israeli companies, or, you know, there are legal cases against organizations like Booking.com, which are responsible for allowing foreigners to stay in, you know, rental properties that were stolen from Palestinians. All of us have ways and means in which we can do this. That's not exclusively fundraising. It just depends a little bit from your context. So I would just encourage you to think about, like, what can my organization do? If it's, you know, as an investment fund or donation matching, or if you're part of an organization that's fueling local policy, how can you integrate this issue into what you're doing and within your context? So I think that's a little vague, but I think that's, you know, what I would suggest that everyone just have a reflection upon is, you know, within my context, what can I do?
Thank you.
Dr. Maza, you can go with your question.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Nadine, so much. You opened a lot of wounds. You know, as Saliba said, we lived most of our life overseas, and we witnessed a lot of this injustice happening to us and to our people, unfortunately. I wonder, why do you think the media is not focused on, you know, what you just did? It's an amazing piece of information, and covers a lot of injustice that is taking place, and of course the brutality of the settlers who are given not only green light but also protection. Why the media is not focused so much about that? My second question would be, in that 1 month, how did you feel about, you know, the people, patience? Do you feel like eventually it's gonna be another intifada? Thank you.
Great question. So on the media point, I think I do think it's changing, and that's why we have to support specifically independent media such as The Intercept, and other kind of investigative arms that we're seeing kind of rise and rising to the challenge of covering this issue. I think it's the fact that Zionists tend to be in very senior positions within a lot of these media organizations, and there's a chilling effect. You know, we've been seeing this since since October 7th, and actually prior to that, where people are losing their jobs when they speak out and so forth. So I think it's a little bit of that. And then I think the reality is that, you know, the other side has generated a fear of, you know, this conflation between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, which a lot of people are a little afraid to touch. But I do think that this will change because, again, these independent media sources are breaking that narrative. The narrative is falling apart. And so actually, while, you know, one thing I will share is, you know, I do feel like it's not enough. But when I actually returned, I actually got a number of media inquiries from ABC and like non-Al Jazeera like outlets who were really curious to learn about this experience. And what they shared with me is that they just didn't understand like how deep it went, especially like now when you hear about the situation in Gaza and hundreds of people are dying every single day. To hear about 3 shootings of, you know, Palestinians here and there, it's so easy to ignore. And that has been the feedback from media, which is just gross. But I think that plays a part of it, that it's always been like little dribs and drabs here and there. And people don't really understand like what the occupation is, how deep it is, how complicit the US is. But I do think it's changing. I really, really do feel strongly that it's changing. And again, humanizing these stories is really important, because otherwise then we just become numbers, and we can't let that happen. And the point around like the Intifada point, you know, I really didn't feel like I saw that. I actually felt like the activists I was working with were so nonviolent in their thinking. And I think a lot of them, to be completely honest, are just tired. They're really tired of having to live this way, and some people have left. I think where I saw like more of this kind of resistance mindset was more so in the urban areas than I did in the rural areas, to be completely honest. And I do think it's probably about time for a third intifada, if I'm just being completely honest myself.
Any other questions?
Yes, a question from me. So you told us that you visit Ida refugee camp in Bethlehem.
Mm-hmm.
So what's your feeling about like when you visit this refugee camp in Bethlehem? What make a change in your life or your visit? Tell us a story about the refugees in Bethlehem.
Yeah. Well, I actually met, and I know this is going to be a little corny, but I did meet a woman who had like the key to her original home. And obviously that's because obviously a lot of the folks who ended up in the refugee camp are victims of the Nakba and obviously the Naksa. So I think actually seeing someone's key versus hearing about its symbolism and just the stories, like physically seeing someone's key was very moving to me. And the fact that everyone just wanted to tell me their story. Everyone was so welcoming. Everyone wanted to talk to me and ask me. And I will say also at the time when I was there, this is when the student encampment movement was really blowing up. And so it was very sweet while I was there. You know, they found out I live in America, and they were like, did you hear about Colombia? Did you hear about what's going up in New York? And they were like telling me about what was happening in the US, because I didn't have social media at the time. So that was really nice to see. And what they said to me, which is a story that will sit with me, is that a lot of folks in the camp basically said that seeing the student encampments made them feel seen by the world for the first time in a very long time. And I think that's just a reminder, you know, those who have family or like don't have family, that, you know, our families, our friends, our Palestinian community in Palestine is seeing all that we are doing here in the US, and everything that we do in the US really does have material impact. And we have to remind ourselves, when we feel, you know, down in the muck and we feel despair, like we have to pick ourselves back up and remember that we're doing it for them and they see everything that we do. And I think that was like a story, to be honest. I know it's not necessarily a story of the Nakba, but it was a story that sat with me, and it reminded me that, you know, I'm not just doing activism to make myself feel good. I'm doing it because they see it, they feel it, and it matters.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Saliba, you can go ahead with your question.
You know, I will ask one more question if there's nobody else. So, so Nadine, you know, you guys, I'm not sure how these trips that you went through and how is that paid and funded. Did you feel when you get there, or these trips and you know, tours that you guys went there to support the and check and document, did the Palestinian Authority supported these things? Did they give you any support? Did they give you any directions? Did they try to do anything to help you guys out? Or these groups are, you know, doing things on their own and documenting things on their own? Any directions, any help from the Palestinian Authority? And what is the Palestinian Authority stance on something like this, of what you guys doing? Did you try to communicate with them? Did you try to get hold of anybody there, or you just ignore them? Thank you.
Oh, great question. I don't know if historically there has been outreach to the Palestinian Authority, specifically in the context when I was there. What I will say is that they do not offer support. We will have I think that may be slightly shifting. We will have a delegation that is going to Palestine on July 9th, and they will be hosted in Ramallah by the municipality. So I'm not sure if that's necessarily like PA sponsored per se, but I will tell you that the PA isn't like super supportive, you know, providing material support. This is very much grassroots led, funded by international donors who feel very strongly about the material impact that this kind of solidarity can have. Also supported by an array of Israeli human rights organizations and international human rights organizations who rely on activists on the ground, not only international, but Palestinian activists as well, to build cases for these violent settlers. So PA was pretty much out of the picture. Whether or not there has been outreach to the PA to kind of support these types of programs, I'm not sure. But what I have found is that the PA has largely been not very supportive or outwardly helpful in offering support.
Thank you.
I think there's a question from Amanda.
Yes, go ahead, Amanda.
Hi, Nadine. First off, thank you so much for this. This is so informative, and it's a pleasure to have you. I work very closely with the youth in our organization, and a lot of concern recently has been, especially right after October 7th, there was a lot of doxing in the community in terms of people that are applying for colleges, college students, people that are going to jobs. And I just want to hear a little bit about, have you faced any backlash since you came back from your time in Palestine in terms that would affect you in your career path? Because it's kind of hard to offer advice to our youth when it's saying, you know, it's a very thin line between wanting to be very activist like you are and outspoken, and I'm also very outspoken as well, but also trying to maintain professionalism in my career and not face consequences for my activism. And it's a very tough pill to swallow, because you want to be loud and proud, but you also don't want to put yourself in a hole.
Yeah, I totally understand this. I mean, just so you know, one of the reasons why the flyer for this event, you know, initially had my face on it, and then we ended up having to remove my face because, of course, there's always the risk of doxing. And I myself have been doxed by specifically, you know, pro-Israel groups here in the Bay Area. It is the risk that I am at this point willing to take, but what I try to do to minimize that risk is I always make sure I'm speaking with a fact base. You know, I speak based on what I know, and I try and make it very clear my caveats, etc. I also think what's really important is not, even within my own organization, you know, it's not particularly, I'd say, like aligned with my perspective, but I try and push within the boundaries to make sure that we do more around this issue and that we don't accept the status quo. So I do think it's a hard line. I really do. And I want to acknowledge that I don't think there's like a magic solution. But I think it's, again, making sure that when we're speaking, you know, we protect our identity as much as we can. If you're speaking, you know, use a first name or don't use your last name, because I do think that, you know, again, there are organizations that make it a point to report us, even if we're speaking truth to power, to our organizations, and threaten, like, you know, dismissal. But I think there are just very basic ways you can minimize that, and that's by using a first name, not necessarily always your last name if you're speaking out. And again, making sure that you're speaking with a fact base is really important as well. And just being really smart, just being smart. You know, if you're doing direct actions, wear a mask, use a different email. Don't use your personal email. There's some, you know, very typical like technology security that everyone should be implementing their day in day. You shouldn't be using WhatsApp. You should probably shift over to Signal, because we do know that there are security concerns with certain platforms. And so, Amanda, I would love to actually pick this up with you.
Yeah, I would love that.
Because I do think, you know, the youth are so important in this movement, and this chilling effect is one that seriously needs to be discussed, because it is really scary, especially if you're young and just starting your career. But I think there are ways to do it smartly. And so I'd love to, you know, have like a follow-on conversation with you about that, because I feel very personally strongly about this too.
Yes, please. I would love that. I will follow up with you after this call.
Amazing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amanda.
We did have another question in the chat. If someone will want to be an activist for Palestine, where should they start?
Find your strength, like find what you're good at and then turn it into Palestine. You know, if you're someone who's really good at speaking, do that. You know, there are so many opportunities to host teaching at your local coffee shop. There, you know, talk to your friends, host a book club. If you're someone who doesn't like to speak, you know, but has really good networks, how can you use your networks to pass legislation? You know, if it's a city council, just find your strength. That's the really important thing. I think, you know, you don't have to put yourself in these like very uncomfortable situations, but we all have a strength that we can hone and use for the Palestinian cause. For me, you know, I enjoy speaking, and, you know, I'm media trained as a result of like my marketing career. And so I use those skills to try and elevate, you know, the conversation around Palestine, but that might not necessarily be something that others are comfortable with. So figure out your strength and then work backwards.
Any other questions?
I do have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for coming, Nadine. This was very thoughtful. And, you know, Beit Sahur organization, or Beit Sahur USA, we have a A&E committee, which we try to get involved more like in politics and that kind of stuff. So we have a program where we're trying to get the youth to get more engaged, especially our youth. We're kind of stumbling on where to start. Is there anything that maybe you can help us with? And of course, we would like for you to get more involved with the organization. Thank you.
Yeah, I would love to. I think what's really important for us is education. I think if people really understand what they're talking about, they're going to feel a lot more empowered to go do something about it. It's really hard when you don't really understand it. And I will say, I thought I understood occupation. You know, I read a lot of books, but literally feeling it and experiencing, even just for a month, has taken on a whole new level of understanding of what it means to live under an occupation. And so I will say it all starts with education. So like hosting teach-ins is really important so that, you know, our youth can feel empowered and can feel like, honestly, I think it's not only empowered to speak, but feel very confident and grounded as to why this matters. That's the starting point. It always starts with education, but I would love to be more involved and would be happy to brainstorm with you and also have, you know, other folks who can also be brought in because, yeah, youth are the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nadine, I think a workshop with the youth and the young adults, if you can participate with something like this, that will go a long way. If you have the time, of course.
I will make the time. Don't worry.
And Amanda is your connection out there. She's ready.
Yes, I will definitely be connecting with you.
Perfect.
Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you so much for having me, everyone. And thank you for such your time on, I don't even know what day it is actually, but Thursday evening. I really appreciate it. And I really look forward to, you know, meeting you all and staying connected and just creating this space for me tonight and just brilliant questions as well.
Yeah, we're going to go ahead and conclude our webinar for today. Thank you again for joining us tonight. And thank you for joining. I hope you guys learned a lot of information today.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Nadine,
Thank
so
you.
much. Very important webinar. And thank you, Joanna. You did great.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Have
everyone.
a safe
for coming.
trip, Nadine.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Nadine. Thank you, Nadine.
Little lady.